Well, friends, good morning or possibly afternoon, depending on when you're watching this. What do you make of our reading today then? I guess the meaning is fairly plain. Um, do whatever your politicians tell you, no matter how unreasonable it is. Um, Wives, if you experience domestic abuse, stay put, hang in there, and just try to be nice. Women, don't wear jewellery, and everything's going to be okay in the end because Jesus died for our sins. The kind of slightly worrying thing is that much of 20th century Christendom has taken these verses in just those sorts of ways. And it fails to really dig deep enough to understand what this passage is really all about and where its power lies. Let's just step back for a moment. Remember when we were in Daniel and we were talking about empire and kingdom and recognizing that there's a massive conflict going on between the kingdom values of the people of God, the people of Yahweh, and the values of the empire. Empires, one after another, come tumbling down as they raise up their heads against God. And the challenge Daniel and his friends had of figuring out when to resist and when to comply and collaborate. In the psalm we opened our service with today, there's talk of God, the mountains quaking, the sense that there's this massive cosmic battle going on. And but that God is in charge, God is in control, God is at the helm, he is leading us in the battle. If we just look back at the verses that ended last week's passage, dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that although they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. There's an expectation that the world is going to be accusing us, against us. Everywhere we look, there's a picture in the Bible of spiritual conflict, spiritual, moral, mental, embraces everything. That the people of God are going to be in conflict with the world in some shape or form. Think about Peter's own life. This is the Peter who in Acts 4 says to the religious authorities when they say, stop preaching about Jesus, they say to him, tell us guys, what do you think we should do? Should we obey God or obey men? He faces them down, he confronts them and he gets himself thrown in prison. This is the Peter who tradition tells us was crucified upside down in Rome. So we need, when we read these words, we need to bear in mind these are not just a few nice words about how to be nice Christians and how not to cause trouble with people, constituted authority. There is fully an expectation that Christians will cause trouble with constituted authority. We're going to be persecuted. Our values will come in conflict with those of the world. This is what spiritual warfare and spiritual conflict is all about. Peter points to the example of Jesus. Here's what he says. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Is this the Jesus we read about in the Gospels? Is this the Jesus who proclaimed 7 woes on the Pharisees and scribes? You hypocrites, you whitewashed sepulchres. Is this the Jesus who constantly critiqued the religious leaders of his day? Well, if you know the story well, you'll know that this is that Jesus, but it was referring to a particular moment in his life, the moment of his arrest. And at that moment, Jesus knew that, first of all, that physical violence was not a productive way to behave, but secondly, that even attempts to say things were at that stage unnecessary, because his life and the behaviour of the authorities at that moment would speak volumes. The civil disobedience kind of movement, who has drawn very heavily on passages like this and the Sermon on the Mount, has recognised that when you comply with arrest, when you have done something, when you have exercised your right to say yes when the government says no, or no when the government says yes, you remember that from Daniel, and if you get arrested for that, then it's an exciting and critical moment, because if you are plainly doing something upright and good, then it's the authorities who are being judged, not you, and people will see that. Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges justly. So let's not shy away from calling out sin and evil wherever it exists. It's a crying shame right now that the church in America is failing to call out the reckless and destructive behaviour of their president. It's a crying shame. Interesting that women, Christian women in the US, are starting to rise up and say, we cannot support this man. We respect our husbands, we respect the position they've taken, but I'm sorry, we just can't do it. Not very submissive, you might think, but they are exercising their voice. They are saying what they think. Let's come to that second passage, which first passage focuses on the political realm, and the second on the domestic realm. And of course, in the ancient world, a wife was the property of her husband. The husband was the authority. There was no ambiguity about that. It's also true that in the ancient world, a woman who was mistreated by her husband had few options. If she was experiencing domestic abuse, she could run back to her parents, but they would almost certainly turn around and say, you go back there, young woman, that's where you belong. Your husband has a right to treat you however he wants. And if he comes after us, we might have to pay him money back. If she ran off into the hills, how could she ever survive? There were very limited choices. Women today have a different set of choices before them to respond to domestic abuse if it gets beyond a certain point. And it's not right for any of us to encourage brutal behaviour and violent behaviour beyond a certain point. That's another story. But I don't want, having said all of that and recognised that submission does not mean we cannot say what we think. This passage never ever says we cannot say what we think. It's all very much about behaviour. It's about not retaliating. It's about not hurling insults. It's quite different from saying what we think. And it's about the power of a choice to submit. So having given all of that caveat, having talked about context and the importance of it, having recognised that we are in a spiritual battle, let's understand what this passage is actually saying. That to submit to hostile and unreasonable behaviour at the right moment, in the right context, can be a tremendously powerful choice to make. That is the point of this passage. That at certain moments, submission and sacrifice carry enormous power. This statement, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. I don't deny that there's a huge cosmic significance to that as well, but there's a very simple and obvious significance to it, that Jesus bore the brunt of the brutal leadership of the leaders of his day. He took it. he took it so that, in a sense, we didn't have to because they were somewhat satisfied then. But that public moment was what convinced so many of his followers and so many people in successive generations that it was the religious leaders who were being judged. The powers of the empire were being judged. The powers of evil were being judged. Not Jesus. Jesus was being vindicated. So choose your moment carefully. Don't be afraid to speak out, to call out evil where it exists, but recognize the power of a choice to submit. And watch to see when the right moment is to do it and exercise that choice. God bless you.